Right, apologies if the glare on this is a bit much. My choice of colour probably hasn't helped. And I know that there is a much more technical way to film your PowerPoint, and I'm going to chat to Kathy and she is going to enlighten me, and it will be fabulous for next week. So for now, please bear with my wobbly film version of our PowerPoint. Right, aims and objectives. We chose this unit because it's a nice light one. Personally, I love anything to do with behaviour management and supporting emotional, social areas of learning and development in children. So I could bang on about this subject for a very long time, but luckily for you all, it only has 2 criteria. So when it comes to writing your assignment, and I'll go into the details of that next week, there are only 2 criteria for you to evidence, and they are 1.1, summarise policies and procedures relevant to promoting children and young people's positive behaviour, and 1.2, explain effective practice in relation to behaviour management. Now we're going to ask you to complete this like a question and answer sheet if you like, okay? So you copy down that criteria, bang it onto a Word document or the document or platform of your choosing, and answer that criteria, okay? If you like to write in an essay format and you want to pull it all together in one, that's absolutely fine, but please make sure that we can easily pick out that criteria within your work. Okay, so we are going to be having conversations with each other over Teams, and it's going to be throughout the week so nobody feels overwhelmed. Okay, I'm going to be setting you some little research tasks and reading tasks, and I'll prompt you on Teams, using that as a platform as we're all using that now, to discuss and reflect and share together. Okay, this is a fantastic unit for sharing your own ethos, your own thoughts and feedback, or the practice that you're using in school. So I look forward so much to hearing how you're all getting on with this and how you're applying various strategies. Right, okay, so let's have a little think around behaviour management in schools. What sets our expectations? It's quite an interesting thing to start on, to be honest. Where do our expectations of behaviour in school come from? Has the outside influence and your own experience shape your expectations? So I just want you to take some time to process that. When we say outside influence, could it be your own upbringing? Could it be the way that you have raised your children? Perhaps where you went to school or your experience of behaviour management in school? Perhaps it's the opinion of your peers, your friends, your parents. Then think, have you been conditioned to expect the standards set by school? So does your school have quite a strong behaviour management policy? Do they have some very specific procedures or expectations or values that they communicate often and implement in potentially a strict way, or do they enforce things quite vigorously? But have you now been conditioned to expect those standards set by school? And then what are the expectations set by your school? Are there expectations your school sets around communication, around the way that students dress potentially, disciplinary policies? Does your school model respect between adults and children? Is there a communal area for adults and children to discuss? Does your school have a particular response to mental health needs and the opportunity for children to meet their social and emotional needs? Are they using Thrive? Are they using PACE? Are they using SEAL? Have a little think about all of those things, and how does that reflect your school's expectations around behaviour? Okay. So then think, how do you manage positive and inappropriate behaviour? A few things for us to think about. Sanctions. Now, sanctions is quite an interesting one because sometimes we don't necessarily think of a strategy as a sanction, let's say. I mean, there's the obvious ones. You're missing playtime, you're going to go in late for lunch, you're not going to be able to take part in this activity, in this play, in this extracurricular thing, in this after school club. Those are all very obvious sanctions. But are there other sanctions that we're imposing on children that we don't quite realise? And can you think what some of them might be? because we have interventions in place for a child, because we're trying to manage their behaviour, and they end up missing out, let's say, on their PE provision, or they don't get to take part on a larger group work because maybe we don't have the staff capacity to support them within that context with the level of staffing that they need. Is that potentially a sanction on that child in relation to their behaviour? Reward systems. I love having a little chat about reward systems. Are the reward systems that we have in place supporting intrinsic or extrinsic motivation? And what I mean by that is the child performing or behaving in a way to just tick a box and get the reward, the sticker, the extra playtime, the non-uniform day? Or are they behaving, achieving, accomplishing something because it just makes them feel good inside, because they just want to, something deep inside of them just wants to do it, okay? We want children, the end goal, whichever side of the debate you're on when it comes to behaviour management, we want children to be able to be intrinsically motivated. We want them to get up and do and achieve because it's what's best for them. That's the end goal. So we have to ask ourselves, with things like these very tokenistic ways of rewarding children, is that helping them to get there? I also like to put a cat amongst the pigeons and say that very often we are rewarding expected behaviour. Very often. My biggest bugbear of all time is the reward for attendance. For a lot of children, it's impossible for them to get 100% attendance, and actually that's because of their additional needs. Maybe they need to go and see an occupational therapist, maybe they can't attend because actually they have a special educational need or disability or medical condition that means they're off school for a little bit often. Maybe actually the child lives in an area of deprivation, or maybe they have some social issues, and actually attendance is out of their hands and it's something that their parents aren't able to support them with. So potentially we're putting a sanction in place by not giving them this reward, but really that it's unachievable for them anyway to get that attendance award. But personally, we expect children to be in school. We expect them to have good attendance. So why are we rewarding that? Okay, because by not rewarding that, very often we're not encouraging the attendance to improve, because very often, especially in primary, attending school isn't a choice that they actively make. It's an outside influence. There's something to think about there. Restraint, interesting one. Does your school, and I would love to know this, so please feedback, does your school have a restraint policy? And if they don't, they probably should. There are some schools that will have a very detailed restraint policy and some very specific training on safe holding and restraining children. I've done this training myself. At Chestnut School, I know that that's something that they implement on a daily, regular occurrence throughout each school day, so they're well versed on a restraint policy. But does your school have a restraint policy at all? Just quick note there, nobody should be restraining a child without the adequate and certified training. And any time a child is restrained, it needs to be documented on paper and it needs to be discussed with the parent carer, and also a report needs to be made to the designated safeguarding lead just to make sure everything's above board. Okay, that aside. Outside agencies. How do you manage probably inappropriate behaviour, we're looking here, with outside agencies? So at what point are you contacting educational psychologists or somebody within the local authority, maybe a specialist that you're looking at there, maybe a social worker, maybe an additional therapist like a play therapist you're potentially working with? At what point do you refer to provisions such as the Chestnut Outreach Service? So this is a service available in Torbay for schools, for settings, who have gone through their school's disciplinary positive behaviour management process. They've put in all the intervention that's available, and they've made a referral to Chestnut School, which is a school for children with social and emotional complex needs. But they also offer an outreach service. Well, they will come and take part in a 12-week programme with children and the school staff and the home to try and improve outcomes and put lasting strategies into place to support the child. Okay, so does your school use anything like that? And lastly, approaches and interventions. Okay, so what interventions are you putting into place? Does your school have Thrive, for example? Does it have SEAL? Does it have PACE? Does it have a mindfulness programme, a Let's Talk programme? There are some amazing, positive, fantastic, life-changing things that are happening right now in the UK to support children with their well-being, with their behaviour, with positivity in general, because all of these things are absolutely linked and integrated, so it's something that we need to have a little think about here. Okay, I want to hear all about this, so I'm going to be asking you questions over the week on Teams, so please come back to me and use everybody's feedback to help you respond to the criteria when it is time. Now, if we just go down here, we will see a article link here, and it's called Why I Don't Do Behaviour Charts. Now, I remember a few years ago, a play therapist that I know very well, when we were having a discussion about a school's policy on behaviour management, gave me this article to read, and every time I deliver anything around behaviour management, I always use it, and I just find it so thought-provoking. So I'm going to let you read it in your own time, but I just want to say before you start reading it, if you have any very strong opinions about how effective class behaviour charts are, behaviour management charts are, times out, C1, C2s, Matt, you'll be familiar with those, that painting, putting names on the board, warnings, traffic light systems. If you have a strong opinion that those things work, I want you to have a little bit of an open mind when you read this. Basically, this article gets you to imagine yourself as an adult in a new job, and that your new boss is basically imposing one of these strategies on you, much like the ones that we implement in school settings, and it asks you to consider why, as an adult, our dignity, our privacy and respect is greater than that of a child, when actually, as an adult, we're able to take the knocks a lot better than a child who isn't fully developed within the area of emotional, social and personal development is. So there you go, thought-provoking read. So please have a read of that. Really important to me that you do, because it's going to be something that we ask you to share your reflections on over on Teams. Okay. Right, another thing that I love to have a chat about, and I know before we broke up for lockdown time, I had started to chatter away to you about brain development. Now, I am very new to talking about brain development and the influence that it has on behaviour, but it's research that I'm undertaking all the time, and I've captured for you two fantastic TED Talks here. The first one is by Dan Siegel, who has written and created some wonderful theories and approaches that are being used all over the world, particularly in the UK. We are moving much more towards trauma-informed practice and all about neurointegration, and actually how we can use the science of brain development and how the brain responds and influences behaviour to actually adapt and influence behaviour management strategies that really support a child's well-being, because that's what's going to bring about lasting change. So the first TED Talk for you to look at is by Dan, and it talks about a 3 brain model, okay, or a true in brain model, and how the cortical, the thinking part of the brain, often becomes disconnected. And as you're listening to it, I want you to consider how when we support a child with their behaviour and we try to promote positive behaviour in children, we're often talking to the child at quite a highly intellectual level, And maybe we need to consider that when a child's in the middle of an emotional meltdown, or maybe they're feeling very anxious or shy or unnerved or angry, they may be in a part of the brain that requires us to get down on a very basic level and provide some very specific, targeted intervention and support that meets that level of need in that brain state. Okay, the second video that I've got for you is another TED Talk. I am a big fan of TED Talks. And this is about applying the True and Brain model to children and young people. Now, this is an absolute fantastic psychotherapist, and she's called Jane Evans. Now, she predominantly focuses her work on children who've experienced trauma in the past, but also with children who have quite complex needs and also behavioural issues. But please note, her True and Brain model that she talks about and the brain states can be applied to not only children but all of us. So as you listen to her TED Talk, she will go through some examples that maybe you can apply to yourself. I know I absolutely can. So quite a nice light-hearted one for you to have a look at. So I just want you to keep in your own mind how well do we recognise the different brain states, and how do we respond to the brain state when we're applying and supporting measures to promote positive behaviour in children. So something to think about there. And as we go on throughout the week, I will hopefully be able to record videos of myself and my eldest talking about brain states and how we can support each other to get into our thinking and our being and doing brains so that we can feel happy and more successful. Okay. I've got a document here for you, and this is Getting the Simple Things Right, produced by the Department of Education, written by Charlie Taylor. It is a behaviour checklist. It's not a great huge document. There is no need to print it. You'll find the link here, but I'll also post the link up on Teams, and there is a separate link to this on Moodle under this unit. So just to give you a very brief overview, Charlie Taylor is an absolute expert when it comes to behaviour. So was the Chief Executive of the National College of Teaching and Leadership from its launch, was a head teacher of a very specialist school for children who have very complex behavioural needs, and also he was the expert advisor until 2012 on behaviour and behaviour management, and produced lots of reviews, this being one of them. Okay, so this is a document that is referred back to, and it provides a very basic checklist really of things that we need to consider when we're trying to support children's positive behaviour. Okay, just as a bit of a disclaimer, we are now into, of course, a new government than the one that Charlie Taylor belonged to when he wrote and produced this document for the Department of Education. And I think we may have had a discussion in class before lockdown, but there is a real movement now and a pilot project underway that maybe takes a different stance on behaviour management. It's becoming very much more of a zero tolerance, and I think the tagline, there are no exceptions when it comes to quote bad behaviour, which is quite very well, it's very different terminology to the one that we've seen before produced by the Department of Education. So watch this space for a little look at how things pan out as we move on in the government's stance on supporting positive behaviour. But for now, we're going to get you to have a look at this one. Okay, so we're setting this for you as a reading task. If you follow the link through this PowerPoint, or go on the one on Moodle or Teams, as I've said, and have a little read through, I want you to consider how you can see evidence of Charlie Taylor's checklist by the Department of Education within your school. Are there things that you see are definitely reflective, or are there elements of this document that actually you don't agree with? You think, actually, I don't truly believe that that's very important, or I don't really know if I understand the benefit of that. Have a little think. There are no rights or wrongs when it comes to this. It's just a reading and reflection task to read this document, take in some key points, and when prompted, I will ask you on team to give me your feedback. Now, this basically is you reading in, researching something, and then you're going to be able to reference it appropriately when it comes to responding to the criteria that we'll set you next week. Okay, so it's like a practice run, if you will, so all the hard work will be done for you when you bring your thoughts together. Okay. Another little reflection for us to think about. Differentiation based on age or stage. So differentiation is basically the way that we respond to different needs and abilities when it comes to our practice, or when it comes to our provision or our planning or assessment or our learning. So right now we're thinking about positive behaviour, and I want you to reflect on the following. How are the following strategies, the ones that we just looked at earlier, used in 14 to 16 provision and FE, so that's further education, and how does this compare to the provision within primary education? So I want to extend that a little bit further. I want us to think about secondary provision in general rather than just 14 to 16. And when we think about further education, that's 16 to 19. How does it compare, do we think, between how we apply things like sanctions in primary education or reward systems? Are the marble jars, do you think, are they gone in secondary, or actually have we replaced them with something that fundamentally is the same? Restraint. What are your thoughts on that? Do we think that a restraint policy within a secondary or FE provision is different to that we see within primary? Outside agencies, are they the same? Can we call on different people this time? Are we going to have the 18-year-old skipping off to the Thrive bus, for example, to play with his puppets every Friday with the Thrive practitioner? What strategies are applied, and are they effective? And just as a little hint and tip, in my experience, I found actually that some of the strategies that I've put into place, even in early years provision, are just as effective when it comes to supporting positive behaviour in teenagers. And if we think back to, hopefully by now, what you've seen in the little brains clips in that slide, actually it's about meeting the needs of that current brain state. Maybe it's about meeting the physical needs, for example, of the child. And really that doesn't tend to change that much dependent on your age. Approaches and interventions. So let's have a little think about that as well. Give me some information. How do you think the approaches and interventions in general change based on the age? But one overarching question I want us to think about when we're discussing this, and sorry, the light on it's so poor, I'm using the wrong colours. How do the needs of the individual shape the approach we take in managing behaviour? So as we all know, we could have a class of 30 children aged 7 to 8, but there are going to be some children in that class that emotionally, socially have a stage of development that is more in line potentially with a 3-year-old, or maybe even younger, or maybe in certain times, in moments of trigger, meltdown, dysregulation, they do revert back to that very much younger age. And if we're applying reward systems or sanctions that are in line with the true age of the children, 7 to 8, how does that really meet the needs of that child's stage of development when it comes to behaviour? So something to have a little think about there. Okay, almost there, guys. Right, this is your final task that's going to be set between now and next week. This is a research and response task. That sounds very formal and exciting. I'm afraid it's policy reading, which does not sound very exciting, does it? But hopefully it will be, because it's something that we're going to explore together. So I want you to research policies for your provision. So maybe that's a local primary, secondary, further education, or SEND school. But I want you to research policies, and by research I mean light read, okay, that cover the following areas: behaviour, code of conduct, rewards and sanctions, dealing with conflict and inappropriate behaviour, anti-bullying and attendance. Now you may find that there are at least 3 of those policies that were all tied up into one policy in your school. That's absolutely fine. Please don't look for individual ones if you find it all within the first. And again, the idea of doing a task like this is that you can discuss it with your peers and you can reflect over Teams. Hopefully we can have a conversation on Teams over text on this, so that you may pick and lift up that content and pop it into your response to the criteria. I'm calling it response to criteria. I'm avoiding calling it assignment because I don't want you to think you've got a mega essay, all right, because you haven't. 2 criteria. But this basically means that you've done your reading and research of relevant policies and you're going to be able to respond to that because you've already discussed it with your peers as well. So fingers crossed, this is a nice way of getting the work done and also getting us to do some deep reflective thinking on how our policies and procedures actually demonstrate an ethos of the school when it comes to how the school feels on promoting positive behaviour. I also want you to reflect on how these policies evidence the DFE guidance we explored, that Charlie Taylor's behaviour checklist. Okay, I will prompt you on Teams with a little brief overview and ask you to just respond back to me. I'm not going to pick out anybody, but I want you to respond back to me as to how you feel your school responds to these certain headings that we've got here, and how within the policy it does reflect various legislation and maybe all the things we've spoken about. I want you to think about whether your school actually does use public shaming in rewards, as you will see in one of the articles that we've posted up, and the impact you think that has on the child, and actually how the expectations are set and how they are communicated. You know, have a little think about all of these things when you're talking to me about your policies and procedures. Okay. Right. We would like to think about these things just lastly when we're talking about our findings, when we're thinking about our discussions. I want us to, over the next week, agree what is at best ineffective and at worst detrimental in managing children's behaviours. So let's have a look at what we think is bad practice. Don't like to use that term bad. What do we think is ineffective at managing children's behaviour? Have we got examples that we've seen? Is the reading and research that we're currently doing around this unit changing our mind on what we thought was a good technique and strategy? And now that we've looked at the underpinning scientific research on toxic stress and cortisol, stress hormone, and the impact that has on the development and growth of the child and holistic development, as we're looking at how the brain responds in different states to various triggers, as we're looking at the Department for Education's behavioural checklist and best practice guidance, and as we're looking at our own policies and procedures, can we start to build a bit of a picture as to what we think is good or ineffective? Okay, so what have we found to be effective in managing children's behaviour? Let's use some of our own examples because I want you to be writing about your own first-hand experiences in your work too. How can we encourage intrinsic motivation in our children? So I had a little chat at the beginning about how the long-term goal is always to get children to do things because they want to do things. They want to do it for themselves, for that wonderful feeling that it gives them. So how can we encourage that in our children? Should we move away from a sanction and reward model? Should we be punishing children for things potentially that they can't help? And should we be rewarding children for expected behaviours? Is that really sincere? Because children are very clever and they can see right through that. And lastly, is there really a one-size-fits-all approach that we can use? Because essentially you'll find that a lot of your policies and procedures do offer a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to how they support positive behaviour or manage behaviour in general. So that's something to have a little think about there. Okay, now, after completing these tasks, listening to the videos, reading the articles, doing your research, I want you to have a little bit of reflection yourself on how this session, however long it takes you, if it takes you a week, 2 weeks, please don't panic about that, it's absolutely fine. How has our session today influence your approach to behaviour management. So think about how you felt at the beginning. Did you have some hard and fast rules when we talked about your own expectations on managing behaviour? And has this potentially influenced that for you? Or has it confirmed what you felt was true all along? Have you developed ideas about the behaviour management approaches that are appropriate and inappropriate for various ages and stages of children? Okay, so are you now thinking about, actually, I'm working with this cohort of children or this age range, I think this could work for them or it might not work for them. Okay, next session, so next week, we're going to look at the good, the bad and the ugly and how to survive. So some more practical tips for you and some areas for us to explore when maybe things do become a little bit more complex and supporting and promoting positive behaviour becomes a little bit more difficult. So hopefully some strategies for you to put into practice when we eventually get back to normal. Okay.